It's wonderful to be with you, and thank you, Tom, for your introduction. I am happy to be here. It's always wonderful to see people return to campus. A preliminary remark before I get started, and it's this. You might think of it as counterintuitive that I don't have a glowing screen behind me. In other words, I'm foregoing the use of digital media in this talk, and there is a reason for it, and it has nothing to do with technological malfunctioning or anything like that. It occurred to me as I was preparing for this talk that since my overall argument will be one of cautious welcome of digital media in relation to practices of faith, I'm going to try and make that argument verbally without the help of flashing screens. So if I succeed, good for me. Let's delve into the subject at hand. I want to begin by sharing a story with you of a recent invitation I got as recent as last week. It came from a seminary in the US, smaller than Yale and not linked to a major research university. But this particular seminary had experienced a profound shift in its student body and the way it taught classes. Namely, by now, 2/3 of the student body are distant learners. So this seminary had begun to teach its classes to 1/3 residential students, 2/3 students at a distance who either joined a class that was taught via live stream or watched it later canned. Stored. What they wanted from me was input on how to think, not about teaching these classes, that's in many contexts routine now, that you have hybrid classrooms, some people are physically present in a room, others join through various technologies or watch the class later in a canned version. What they wanted to have my input on and what they struggled with was the fact that this particular seminary for over a century had understood its life, its communal life, to be focused on worshiping together every day. And they suddenly realized that although teaching classes via live stream or canned, as well as residential, was one thing, how to form a community around daily worship where co-presence is constituted digitally was a different matter. Yale Divinity School isn't at that point, but probably at least some of you in your own ministries and work with communities of faith have experienced this struggle, how to think presence and co-presence, and how to think about constituting community across vast distances. And that typically involves now forms of digital mediation. So what I can offer in this conversation is not so much my expertise in liturgical studies, which is what I was trained to do, nor in Catholic theology, which I was also trained to do, but the work I've done around theories of digital media and how to think about this process of transformation in relation to practices in congregations, seminaries, my own prayer life, you name it. Now, as you can see from my graying hair, I'm not a digital native. I didn't come to this topic because I was birthed into the digital age. My son cannot believe when I tell him that I wrote my dissertation on a typewriter. It's equivalent to going to the Peabody Museum and seeing a dinosaur. I kid you not. It's an unimaginable world for digital natives, that there are people who predate what they breathe as air, digital media. Now, my short story of how I came to be engaged and intrigued by this phenomenon of, let's say, the digital age or digital media is twofold. In one is simply that I had a child who grew up as a digital native, and as all of you know who have shared that trial, it's wonderful and makes you stupid, or feel stupid much of the time, but also forces you to engage a world that you might have hesitated to be engaged in otherwise. But there was a second reason for me to enter this the world of digital mediation, and it had to do with an accident. I lost a beloved paper prayer book, print prayer book, that I had used for that point 30 years, morning and evening prayer and Compline. And as print prayer books and print Bibles go, some of you will be able to resonate with that. It wasn't simply dots on a page between a book cover. It was pressed flowers and photos of loved ones and annotations in the Psalms about what spoke to me when, people to pray for, the occasional perfume strip from an airport duty-free shop. It was a multimedia event, this little prayer book. And of course, its use, the fact that it was coming apart at points, was also a sign of, in a sense, a journey with God, a prayerful journey with God through time. So when I lost this little prayer book on a plane, and nothing brought it back, lost and found and everything, I tried it all, including praying to Saint Anthony, the patron saint of lost things. He did not come through for me. What to do? An additional problem for me was that because I live in different languages, my prayer book was linked to my language of origin. So I couldn't simply replicate it here. And in this, what am I gonna do? And my whole universe just collapsed. The way I live with God through every day, I stumbled into a digital mediation of daily prayer. And I found it intriguing. I found it opened up ways of praying that I hadn't engaged before. And in the end, this is how I now pray much of the time, with the help of digital media. What I found particularly intriguing, some of you may be using daily prayers that are digitally mediated. There are various forms, obviously. What I found particularly intriguing was that it allowed me to step back from reading prayers as in a book to an auditory experience, because it was, the app I use has both audio and a text. But I moved away from reading the text to listening. And the app I use is not only an audio of the Psalms being read, but also, for example, calls you into prayer by the ringing of bells. Now, if you're European like me, the ringing of bells is in your cultural DNA as a marker of communities of faith praying. So it resonated with me. Anyway, long story short, I realized suddenly that my scholarly field of liturgical studies, while I was happily engaging in digital mediation for my daily prayer, produced a long list of negatives. Oh, liturgy online, terrible. The digital age will be the end of our humanity. I kid you not, that's one of the sort of subtexts. So I came face to face with this disconnect that I thought, this is curious. I find this enriching, while my field kept bashing digital mediation as nothing but dangerous. And that led me then to both explore more deeply in practice forms of digital mediation related to lives of faith, as well as why my own field was so negative towards digital forms of practicing one's faith. And how to bridge the gap between these two. Now, some of the conclusions I came to, I simply want to present for you. I am not married to digital media. So if you have very different experiences or viewpoints, that is utterly fine with me. I think I have at least some substantiating evidence for thinking the way I think. I will add that in a class I taught in here last fall, Foundations of Christian Worship, I think some of you might have taken that class in years past. But I did a unit on digital media and liturgical practices, and sort of my spiel about this. Nuanced, positive overall. At the end, especially the younger students really lit into me. And I thought, wait a minute. How can this happen? These are the digital natives. They had drank the Kool-Aid of not digital media, but how destructive it was of their humanity. And to link it with practices of worship for them was not where they wanted to go. I had a similar experience actually in my parish downtown. I sing in the choir, we introduced the cloud hymnal, so we sang from tablets. The music was on tablets. Yes, initially I thought I will die. And a year later, it's fine, what's the problem? Anyway, the parish was going to transition all its liturgical texts into cloud hymnal and online. And guess what? We thought, well, we'll save paper, it's good for the environment. It was the students who said, no way. This is the 1 hour, other than being under the shower, when we are offline. We don't want digital media in our worship services. So I learned that the terrain is complicated. It's not just, young people are gung-ho into the use of digital media, and us older folks struggle with it. That's not at all how this plays out. Anyway, here are some of my some of my scholarly talk away thinking through digital media and practices of faith. Initially, my argument was very simple, and I think everybody can agree with this in this room, that at this point in time, communities of faith and scholars and ministers don't have the option anymore of simply ignoring these forms of digitally suffused living that shape our everyday lives. Second, to think that practices of faith are the one area in life immune from that. So yes, we check the weather online, we communicate with family and friends online, we get directions to YDS online, news online, but faith is a separate cultural pocket. Well, it's not. And in fact, statistics show that practices of faith, and not only Christian, you name it, Buddhist, Muslim, Hindu, Jewish, play significant roles in digital cultures. Online religion sites are among the most vibrant in digital social space. You may not know that if you get your news from, I don't know, the Wall Street Journal or whatever, although it recently actually had a little essay on technology and worship. But just to cite one statistic, the Bible app YouVersion, some of you may be familiar with it or using it, is equal in terms of users to Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. That's a massive amount of users. And it's Christian and it's biblical. I mean, who knew that this, well, I did, but after reading the studies, but who knew that Christian practices of reading the scriptures, prayer, are so significant numerically in digital social space? So, ignoring these practices and forms of digital mediation isn't an option anymore. How to think with these practices, though, rather than knee-jerk negative against them. To begin with, I think, and I need to keep reminding myself of that, we have to acknowledge that there are substantial misgivings aroused by digital mediation. One of the more routine ones, and it has resurfaced in the last 3 years, is that being online or in a digitally suffused space amounts to a disembodied, virtual, and therefore unreal way of living. So, how to engage that particular thought process? From a theological point of view, and as a Christian theologian, I would say the kernel of truth in this is, for Christians at least, that behind these misgivings about digital media is the fact that human bodies are the prime media of Christian living and of practices of worship. I haven't yet seen someone without a body in my parish. I can see them with my spiritual eyes, those who have gone before. But the folks who are in the pews with me have bodies. In contradistinction, digitally mediated practices seem for many people to foster an illusion. They happen, so the argument goes, in a fictional space. They are virtual, after all, rather than real. What to make of that? I think the assumption that digital worlds are unreal and illusionary, based on this distinction between virtual on the one hand and real on the other, is not tenable. This stark distinction between this is virtual, this is my real world, has blurred significantly, especially since the emergence of Web 2.0, so that would be around 2005. If Web 1.0 is basically about information being communicated, Web 2.0 opens up a world of interactive engagement that is quite different from the earlier web as information. And of course, with smartphones emerging, internet accessing devices that are portable, people have rapidly assimilated online existence into their daily living. So this division between online is virtual and false, offline is real, doesn't hold too much water anymore for many lives. Secondly, I think because of these shifts, presence is experienced and understood in more fluid ways than breathing the same air in the same room has led us to believe is the core reality. So those of us in the room share a physical co-presence, but I would bet you that some of you in your own minds might be closer to someone who is not here than you are to me right now. Think of a sick child that you might have left behind, or a sick grandchild. You might, in your living this moment, be much closer to someone on the other side of the Atlantic, in my case, or on the other side of the continental US, or you name it, than you are to the people with whom you breathe the same air. So in other words, we are beginning to, I would say, rediscover, but let's say discover, that physical co-presence, breathing the same air, is not the only or prime marker of presence. A third point that is often used to critique digital media, namely that they are disembodied. So they foster this illusion because it doesn't seem to require a physical body to enter digital space. Now, given that Christian faith is deeply incarnational, wedded to God having assumed matter, materiality, a human body, we have to take that seriously, misgivings about a disembodied state in a sense. But in fact, no digital world can be entered, no website accessed, no app installed without a body. If I want to enter a digital world, I need my index finger, minimally. Now, what I want to suggest to you is that digital social space is not disembodied. It does need bodies, but the protocols, the bodily protocols of digital space differ from offline engagement. Okay, so quite often, and you know this from your own experience, I'm sure I'm just describing what all of you know if you check your digital pulse regularly. And it is this, that the difference, let's say, between offline and online bodily proprieties or embodiment is that different parts of your body become key elements. So typically when you enter digital media, what's very busy are hands and eyes. What might not be that busy are legs. But the notion that digital social space is an embodied reality, while offline is embodied and therefore real, I think creates a false distinction. They require different kinds of embodiment, but both are embodied. What is often absent in digital social space, and this becomes an issue for practices of communal prayer and worship, which is what the seminary mentioned at the beginning was after, is physical co-presence. Although, just as a footnote, we are living through rapid technological advances that are now generating ever-intensifying bodily immersion and tactile involvement in digital worlds. Think of, if you have grandchildren especially, that might be on the horizon, virtual reality headsets and data gloves and things like that. When I first started this work, I could always glibly make reference to some things that are gained in digital mediation and some things that are lost in digital mediation. And my prime example of something that is lost in digital mediation was always smell. So in liturgical traditions, if you use incense, and you transition liturgical practices digitally, let's say by live streaming your worship services, you can indicate the result of incense, smoke going up and that kind of stuff, but you can't communicate digitally smell. Well, lo and behold, some smart kids are now testing ways of communicating smell digitally. So I've forgone that nice argument, but until they actually produce the technology to communicate digitally, the smell, I'm still holding out that example might work. I'm running up against time. I want to make sure that I highlight what is really crucial for me in all of this. Oh, maybe the other side of the coin that's important to add in, is it the other side of the coin? No, choose your metaphor, is that even without digital mediation, our lives of faith and worship have increasingly become technologically enhanced, let's say. If your parish uses a sophisticated sound system, or even a very basic one, you can't easily make the distinction between, worship has to be natural and not technologically enhanced. If you use contact lenses, cochlear implants, artificial hips, arterial stents, have ever considered cosmetic or gender reassignment surgery, our bodies are increasingly already technologically enhanced. So I think a glib, we want our worship to be offline and natural, has already died the death of us living in the 21st century. Now, I suggest that these signposts, when taken together, sort of attending to critiques that might emerge, actually open up a space to think with rather than against practices of faith in digital worlds. And I think of them as on a continuum with strictly offline practices of faith. So these are not two different worlds. They follow on this continuum of a digitally suffused living that all of us are engaged in these days. Similarly, I would argue that forms of active participation, such a key concept for some of us in liturgical traditions that prize that terminology and what's behind it. I think forms of active participation are possible in digitally mediated practices of faith. The seminary I talked about earlier has attempted to translate its worship life or stretch it across distances for their distance learners. So one possibility is for the whole community to gather in a digital social space like Zoom or so, and for distance learners to bring in intercessions. Someone at a distance could even offer the sermon. People sing together in this digitally mediated space. So it's not as if digital mediation makes you passive and only passive, while offline, in the same room, breathing the same air makes you active. In fact, I'm reducing you to a large amount of passiveness? Passivity? Whatever. It's your language, not mine. Let me highlight one last point. I have lots more material, but I want to leave ample room for questions because there might be experiences in this room or ways of thinking that I myself haven't thought about. In terms of faith communities' experiences of community across distances, the first thing I would want to say is that the Christian church on its journey through time, in a sense, has always had a notion of belonging beyond physical co-presence. Think of what we invoke as the communion of saints. These are not people whom primarily you breathe the same air with. You do, but in a more complex way than St. Augustine standing next to you and actually breathing the same air. I doubt he needs that. I mean, to breathe air. So the church in some ways can draw on a rich tradition of thinking ecclesial belonging beyond the people who breathe the same air in one room already. With digital media, the advancement of technologies in that regard, I think we see a heightened emphasis, and there we simply have to confront the newness of digital media rather than looking into our tradition and saying, aha, we have it all already in the past. With digital media, we see a heightened emphasis not on physical co-presence as a marker of belonging, but on simultaneity. So I am Skyping at the same time as someone in Europe is, with someone in Europe, different time zone, everything, but we share simultaneity across a vast distance. And my argument is that is a form of community, of belonging, that shouldn't be denigrated because it's digitally mediated and not predicated on two people breathing the same air. Couple of things if you want to be really startled and think ahead, and with that I'll close. This wasn't on my radar screen when I worked on this book at worship, but I think if I had to do another book on the same subject, now in 2019, there are three things I would have to take into account. So the next person writing about this, here are your marching orders. The first thing is that I think in the last 2 or 3 years, our eyes have been opened by force in some ways to the truly horrendous aspects of digital media. Think of what algorithms did in the 2016 election, bots that were created. Think of the fact, I have the numbers somewhere, they were so startling that I tried to ban them from my head. But think of the fact that there are, and I think I can recall the numbers correctly, 45 million images and videos of abused children available online as of 2 months ago. 45 freaking million images and videos, not just porn, but underage children being sexually abused. So there is a vast world in digital mediation that is, I don't call it dark. I think particularly in the context of ongoing racism, that's a bad idea. I call it sinister. There is a sinister web out there, and we need to confront that head on. So that's the one thing that the negative and truly frightening facts about digital mediation, I think, deserve attention, as long as we don't take that then as an easy cop-out to say, oh, therefore it's bad and we won't think about it anymore. In addition, and this is a second point, I think the issue of robotics and artificial intelligence is here to stay, and someone needs to work on powerful artificial intelligence consumer products, drones, social media algorithms. AI is beginning to be used in ecclesial practices. Think of, some of you might have encountered that, robots in elder care, or robotic animals in elder care. And this isn't going to stop anytime soon. So, there was a third point, and what was it? Well, simply to say this, that I think different ecclesial traditions, and I assume different traditions are represented here, by their own sort of DNA, approach digital media very differently. So what I've presented here is one particular view coming out of my own subject position. But when I survey the landscape overall, it seems to me that, for example, evangelical communities are quite willing to enter the high-tech fray. Syrian Orthodox communities may be less, unless you're in a refugee camp in Turkey and your only access to a Sunday Mass is via a live stream on your smartphone. So it all depends on where a particular community finds itself. On that cheerful note, let the questions begin. I think we have about 10 minutes, is that correct? Who is the timekeeper?
We have about 15.
Okay. Shall I navigate the questions?
Yes.
Go ahead.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for this, because I have found myself sort of accidentally in very much an online media world in which most of my folks, most of my, as they call themselves, podrissioners, are actually virtual, in a way that they could never have even been in the room with us because we could never fit that many people. And so I just wanted to give a couple of examples very briefly.
Yeah.
After Hurricane Maria, a number of Disciples of Christ congregations had to shut down in Puerto Rico. And so they get together at people's houses where somebody might have Wi-Fi, and they watch our service, but they're in a community of like 5, 10 people. And I know of about 10 different places that do this every week at the same time so that they're worshiping with us. At Bright Divinity School, they worship, the Latinx group worships with us, I think, on Thursdays. But so it's not exactly at the same time, but I wonder about the simultaneity piece that you were talking about. At Rikers and Sing Sing, the chaplains will watch our service or bring our service to a room in the prison, and the very interesting thing they do there is communion as blessed by us, but these are not necessarily chaplains who would be able to bless the elements there. And they don't have, obviously, they don't have juice, so they use water, and they use bread, and how we think through all that is an interesting, all of my friends from ISM are probably shaking. So anyway, it's an interesting time to try to figure out how you pastor in that kind of setting, and how, anyway, I have lots to say of that, but I would welcome you to worship with us in one of the ways that where others do that way.
Okay, thank you. I don't have anything to say in response other than thank you for sharing those stories with us. The more we learn about what communities are doing and how they are thinking about this, the better. Well, I think the gentleman at the back there was next.
I was a student here in the 60s when Marshall McLuhan had the message. The medium was the message.
Yeah.
And there were many who believed in terms of the church that the spoken word would be dead and everything had to be visual to be important. And it's kind of interesting what then it was either or, but what I hear you saying joyfully today, it's both.
Yes, although I think the ascent of digital media has clearly flooded our consciousness and our world with images more so than words alone. One theorist said that words alone now are like orphans. Images will have, want to take care of the words to communicate better, which is one reason why I thought, I'll be different and just do my own multimedia self. It can still be done, but I think culturally we have seen a huge shift towards people's subjectivity requiring and wanting a saturation with images, more so than with words. Which puts pressure on Reformation churches who foreground in worship the word. Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. I wanted to bring up an experience I had about 2 weeks ago online. I do a digital interview series with womanist theologians, and we often do a talk back online after the actual conversation. And we've noticed that our talkbacks, sometimes there's a lot of questions, sometimes there aren't, but the conversation we did 2 weeks ago was almost silent online. And the person who we were interviewing texted me offline and said, I've gotten about 15 to 20 direct messages, emails, and text messages, but they're afraid to post it on Facebook. And so I've been sitting with this feedback about vulnerability online and people being so afraid to say the wrong thing, so unwilling to engage in back and forth in dialogue, that the very reason why we do it online is so that everyone has access, but then people are afraid to be vulnerable. And so I just wonder if in your work, if you've done any work around that issue of how do you engage people in a vulnerable space on digital platforms.
Yes, in fact, one of the online parishes I studied prided itself on its doors being wide open because people could enter anonymously, and that created an incredible openness to sharing. But if whatever platform you use doesn't allow anonymity in posting, then you have the same problem you have offline. So it's a question of how you tweak, how you render access online. But the wisdom is that many online, I mean, the conventional wisdom of folks who study this is that online anonymity, particularly in faith communities, enables people who would never enter a church door offline to actually come forward. They are very open about, for example, writing prayers and intercessions that they would never dare to speak because they think their language isn't beautiful enough to speak up in a worship service or whatever. Online, it's just, let my fingers do the praying. And so it's a diverse reality, this anonymity and veiling how one is present or who is present.
That just sounds scary. Like I get so many bad threats.
Yeah.
At least I know.
Oh, sure.
You know. That's all.
Yeah. Yes. And
Thank you. I think this is really important. I have a question about Yale Divinity School. I think is still trying to be residential, like the premier residential seminary in the world. But I am, because I've taught one class online, I am intrigued with this idea that some people feel safer saying things about faith, about their biography, about, like one woman said in the online platform that she's in prison, and we never would have gotten her. So, but I am curious about this vulnerability question, then if you allow anonymity, how to deal with the hate speech question. So can you say, what are some of these websites then that you recommend for an online parish that allows people to enter anonymously, and what are the safeguards? Is this all in your book? I mean, I'm so behind as a digital
yes, but I can't point you to a website that lets your parish do that. I studied some, and this wasn't actually a parish, well, it was an online parish alone, supported by various offline congregations. I think the issue will be how you set up digital social space for both access and safety. One of the sites that I think is no longer active, that I studied, the Church of Fools, ended up having to, this was an online sanctuary in a virtual reality space. They had to post avatars as guards and then throw out people who came in to disrupt. So it's not that different from offline, but differently complicated. I think people might be leaving for other things. Tom, is that?
But most people are still here. So
Okay, one last questions. Maybe I sort of ignored this side and there were several hands up.
I was going to ask about the vulnerability issue we're facing as well.
Yeah.
I was going to ask about the experience of transcendence and how it can be mediated. The experience of transcendence and how it is mediated by a digital presence and a digital service.
That's an excellent question. One media theorist, early on, it was 2007 or so, gloated, saying this is the new transcendence. Because online you can create technologically the sense of multimedial mystery. I don't go there. I don't go there. Maybe if we ask how we can encounter God online is a better way than how to communicate transcendence online. Because I think transcendence is culturally coded. For me, it might be, as a Catholic, it might mean lots of incense and some Latin. You know, I was in a Pentecostal church for 3 years. Transcendence didn't mean Latin and incense. It meant singing in the Spirit. So I would be cautious with sort of finding markers for transcendence and then checking how online engages with those. But if you ask how to encounter God online, read my book. The last few pages try and make sense of that. So that's it. Thank you for being here.